Well, I asked in the last video and you resoundingly answered. In our previous video on 7 books I would recommend for understanding the Hebrew Bible, I said if you want to see 7 more, because this was a hard list to pare down, let me know. And y'all let me know. You said you did. So, Disciple Dojo, we listen to our viewers, give them what they ask for. Here we have 7 more books for anyone looking to better understand the Old Testament, aka the Hebrew Bible. While I grab those, if you appreciate this channel and haven't already, we would love for you to subscribe. And I also want to remind you, Disciple Dojo, we are a 501c3 nonprofit ministry. Very little of our funding actually comes from YouTube. Most of it comes from people who believe in the ministry of Disciple Dojo, and they support us on a monthly basis at, some $5 a month, $10 a month, some $200 a month. We have monthly dojo donors, and they are who keep this channel going. So if you appreciate it, we would love for you to consider becoming a monthly Disciple Dojo donor. You can do that at the link that's right here on the screen. And if you do become a donor, or you are currently a Disciple Dojo donor, I would love to send you, just as a little thank you, one of our iron-on patches. So all you have to do, if you're a donor on a monthly basis, just shoot me an email through our website's contact form and say, I'm a donor. You don't have to tell me how much. That's not up to me. Our board handles all that. But I'm a donor, and I would love either a dark or a light colored Disciple Dojo iron-on patch, and I will happily get one of these to you. All right, let's talk about 7 more books that I recommend to anyone who's looking to better understand the Old Testament. Now, before we jump into the 7 books, I want to take care of 2 honorable mentions, because these aren't books, but these are resources, and they are incredibly useful in your understanding of the Hebrew Bible in particular. The first one is the archaeological, not the archaeology, but the archaeological study Bible from Zondervan. Now, sadly, tragically, inexcusably, this is out of print. I'm waging a one-man crusade to get Zondervan to bring back this resource, because this is my favorite study Bible. There are some other good ones out there. This one, for me, is at the top of the heap, and it's because of what it contains regarding particularly the Old Testament. This was done by the faculty of Gordon Conwell Seminary when I was a student there. So yes, there's a little bit of bias because a lot of my professors contributed to what's in here, but that doesn't change the quality of what you find. See the review that we've done here on the channel. I'm not going to go through it, but this study Bible, the background information, getting you into the world of the Hebrew Bible, the ancient Near East, the archaeology, the culture, this thing is just incredible. And like I said, it is criminal that this is no longer in print. You can still find them on eBay and in used bookstores in different places. So that's the route you'll have to go if you want one. If you see one of these out in the wild, get it. The second honorable mention resource that I have to include is Chronological and Background Charts of the Old Testament by John Walton. This is published by Zondervan, and it is exactly what it says. This is just charts and organizing the information of the Old Testament, family trees, timelines, different types of sacrifices, the different canons of the Hebrew Bible, genealogies, interpretations of things like Daniel's vision or Jephthah's daughter. Did he sacrifice her, or did he consecrate her to perpetual virginity? The extent of the flood, arguments for a global flood, arguments for a local flood. This is just an absolutely wonderful resource, especially if you teach or preach the Hebrew Bible. It's probably available digitally, and if it is, that would be the route to go, because then you could copy and paste. This, though, was created, the print version was created for people back during the age of Xerox machines, so that you could literally lay the chart down, photocopy it, give it as handouts to your Sunday school class, whatever. This is a fantastic resource. Now, as for the books themselves, my number one recommendation I'm going to start with on this list, and this is for the broad beginner level. Christopher Wright's The Old Testament in 7 Sentences. This is short, it's a paperback, and it's a beautiful entry into what the Old Testament is all about. Unsurprisingly, it's 7 chapters. Each chapter is based around a specific text of scripture. So one verse, that's what it means by in 7 sentences. It could also be in 7 verses. And each of those summarizes a specific theme that's important to the overall theology of the Old Testament. So number 1 is creation, Genesis 1:1. Chapter 2, Abraham. All the peoples of the earth will be blessed through you, Genesis 12:3. Chapter 3, Exodus. I am the Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery, Exodus 22. Chapter 4, David. The Lord has sought out a man after his own heart and appointed him ruler of his people, 1 Samuel 13:14. Chapter 5, Prophets. What does the Lord require of you but to do justice, love kindness, and walk humbly with your God? Micah 6:8. Chapter 6, Gospel. How beautiful on the mountains are the feet of the one bringing good news. Isaiah 52:7. Chapter 7, Psalms and Wisdom. The Lord is my shepherd. Psalm 23:1. And then at the back, there are discussion questions to go along with each chapter. So this would make for a great small group study. You got 7 weeks. You want to kind of do a flyover of the Old Testament, learning about these concepts. Like, for instance, here's a whole article on the land. Here's one on the Canaanite genocide. There's a presentation of the tabernacle. Phenomenal resource, super easy to get into, makes a great study material for a small group, Sunday school class, campus ministry, whatever. Or, like I did, you can just read it on your own. My second recommendation is on the other end of the spectrum. This is more technical. This is particularly aimed at people who are going to be teaching or preaching from the Old Testament. But any interested student of Scripture can and should benefit from what's in it. And that is Old Testament Exegesis by Doug Stewart. This is an older edition. This is the 3rd edition. I don't know what edition they're on now. Doug Stewart was one of my professors. He also taught my dad when he was in seminary, so he's a family friend, and he's a wonderful Old Testament scholar. And this has been a staple in a lot of introductory Bible interpretation seminary classes for a reason. It walks you through how to exegete an Old Testament passage. So it's basically, after the introduction, there's a guide for full exegesis of the original text. That has to do with text criticism. Short guide for sermon exegesis, how to do study, particularly when you're looking to not teach a class or make a YouTube video, but when you're looking to preach on a Sunday morning. And then part 4, exegesis aids and resources. And this is the one that probably is updated in newer editions to include newer resources as they come out. This edition was published in 2001. So, this is 25 years old now. So get the newer versions because that's probably where the most difference will lay. Then after that, the index of authors and scripture passages. Then he has a list of common Old Testament exegesis terms and a list of frequent hermeneutical errors. If you've seen our video here where Professor He-Man behind me talks about mistakes that preachers often make, this is a section that deals with that as it pertains to the Old Testament. And then there's an analytical table of content. So this is like a step-by-step, so you can see in the process of exegeting a passage which step you're on, or did I forget something, or this is just the guide for full exegesis. It starts with the text. So you have to determine what text am I trying to exegete, what passage I'm going to preach on, what passage I'm going to teach on, what I'm studying right now, confirm the limits of the passage, compare the versions, reconstruct and annotate the text, present poetry in versified form. I mean, this is step by step. There's a section on translation, and obviously this would be for those who have access to Hebrew and or Aramaic. Prepare a tentative translation of your reconstructed text, check the correspondence of text and translation, revise the translation as you continue, provide a finished translation. And then it goes into all the other things: historical context, research the historical background, research the social setting, research the historical foreground, research the geographical setting, date the passage. Literary context, examine the literary function, examine the placement, analyze the detail, analyze the authorship. So it goes through, I won't read all of these because that's the whole book, but it goes through step by step how to do Old Testament exegesis. It has discussions of the different texts of the Old Testament: the Septuagint, the Dead Sea Scrolls, the Peshitta, the Targumim, the Vulgate, how to use BH3 and BHS. Those are the critical editions of the Hebrew Bible. The ongoing Biblica Hebraica Quinta, 25 years ago, it was being worked on, and it'll probably continue to be worked on for the next 25 years at least. The Masorah, those little notes in the margins of the Masoretic text. Then there's a section on translation theory, translation aids. There's bibliography for interlinears and things that'll help you as you're working through a translation. A lot of bibliographical references. This isn't like thrilling edge of your seat reading. This is meat and potatoes, how to get the job done by a phenomenal Old Testament scholar. Now, staying in the realm of preaching and presenting the text, my third recommended book would be Preaching the Old Testament by Scott Gibson. Scott Gibson was actually my preaching professor in seminary, but he's the editor. The essays themselves come from different scholars and teachers and preachers. So there's a foreword by Haddon Robinson, which is Haddon Robinson was considered like the dean of preaching professors in the 20th and early 21st century. Then the intro by Scott Gibson. And then chapter 1, The Challenges to Preaching the Old Testament by Scott Gibson. Chapter 2, Keeping Your Hebrew Healthy by Dennis Magary. Chapter 3, Preaching from the Historical Books by Carol Kaminsky. If you remember our last video, she is the one who wrote Casket, that study through the Old Testament. That's her chapter. Preaching the Old Testament Narratives by Jeffrey Arthurs. Preaching from the Law, Doug Stewart, the previous author I just mentioned. Preaching from the Prophets, John Sailhammer. Preaching the Old Testament in Light of Its Culture, my friend and former professor Tim Laniak. Toward the Effective Preaching of New Testament Texts that Cite the Old Testament by another friend and former professor, Roy Champa. Preaching the Old Testament Today by David Larson. And Preaching the Old Testament Evangelistically by Robert Coleman. And then there's an afterword by Scott Gibson. Now, this is aimed at preachers, but any student of the Bible can learn a lot from this. You don't have to be a preacher to benefit from knowing how to preach from the law, for instance. This is Doug Stewart's chapter on it. And it's one of the best chapters. I cite this in our Bible for the Rest of Us course here on the channel because it's just good for anyone to know, not just preachers. Same thing with all of the other chapters. This is as much of how to interpret the Old Testament as it is how to then turn and preach it to other people. So you don't have to be a preacher to benefit from this book. And that's why it's number 3 on this list. Now, moving from something written for the purpose of preaching to something that's a little more scholarly focused. And that is another former professor of mine, Jeff Niehaus. I know I'm name dropping like crazy on this, but there's a reason I went to Gordon Conwell, and it's because of the Old Testament faculty in particular. So I'm absolutely going to recommend the work of people who have been incredibly formative, and Niehaus was one of them. His book, Ancient Near East Themes in Biblical Theology. He's written a thicker book, God at Sinai. If you want to delve into that one, go for it. This is just a little, obviously it's thinner, it's a little less intimidating for the average reader, and it's broader in scope. What he does is looks at general themes that were important to people outside of Israel and within Israel in the ancient Near East. Knowing that background helps us read the text better because we're getting closer to the situation in which the original readers would have heard it. It's 7 chapters. Chapter 1, Approaching Biblical Parallels in the Ancient Near East. Incredibly important chapter. Like, what do we do with these supposed copying? You know, did Moses copy the Gilgamesh epic or the Atrahasis epic or the Enuma Elish? Is it that simple? Or is the relationship a little more complicated? So great opening chapter. Then chapter 2, God and the Royal Shepherd. You know, the concept of a king being a shepherd is not unique to Israel. Chapter 3, Covenant and Conquest. Chapter 4, City, Temple, Image. Chapter 5, City and Temple, Abandoned and Restored. Chapter 6, The Covenant Household, Destruction and Salvation. Chapter 7, The Restoration of All Things. And then a concluding chapter called A Symphony of Parallels. So if you're wrestling with how do you incorporate the ancient Near East and the culture of the ancient Near East and the concepts that we see from the wider ancient Near East world and then turn and see them in Scripture as well, does that mean that Scripture is just another version of ancient Near East mythology? If those are the kind of questions you wrestle with, definitely check out this volume by Niehaus, Ancient Near Eastern Themes in Biblical Theology. Sticking with this concept of the ancient world and the parallels within it and how it shapes our reading of Scripture, my number 5 recommended book would be John Currid's little book, Against the Gods. It's short, it's not super technical, but it does get into how the biblical writers use those parallel concepts that Niehaus notes, particularly for the purpose of polemics. This is about polemical theology. It's 11 chapters. Chapter 1, A Brief History of Ancient Near Eastern Studies. Chapter 2, The Nature of Polemical Thought and Writing. Chapter 3, Genesis 1 and Other Ancient Near Eastern Creation Accounts. Chapter 4, Ancient Near Eastern Flood Accounts and the Noahic Deluge of Genesis 6 through 9. Chapter 5, Joseph, the tale of the two brothers and the spurned seductress motif. Chapter 6, the birth of the deliverer. Chapter 7, the flights of Sinuhe and Moses. Chapter 8, who is I am that I am? Exodus 3 and the Egyptian book of the heavenly cow. It's a great chapter title. Chapter 9, the rod of Moses. Chapter 10, the parting of the waters of the Red Sea. Chapter 11, Canaanite motifs. Chapter 9, the rod of Moses. This was a fantastic chapter. There was stuff in here that I had not even caught before, and the parallels in the ancient Near East and what it would communicate. Like, why is Moses' rod so important in the narrative? Great chapter that talks about it. You don't have to know Hebrew or any other ancient Near East language to benefit from this book. This is written at an introductory level. Now, introductory meaning you have to be an interested student of history in the Bible. But if you're watching this channel and you've watched so far in this video, I'm willing to bet you could handle this. So, recommendation number 5, Against the Gods by John D. Currid. My 6th recommendation, this one has to do with issues surrounding the documentary hypothesis. The idea that particularly the Torah, the Pentateuch, was the result of combining at least 4 different sources, nicknamed J, E, D, and P, how it was put together. That's a dominant view in mainline Hebrew Bible scholarship, but it's a view I think actually has very little, if any, objective evidence. It's based largely on the presuppositions of 19th and early 20th century scholars. And in light of other ancient Near East culture and literature that's been discovered since then, it makes less and less sense, which is why the documentary hypothesis is fragmenting into so many different versions of it that at this point there is no consensus on it. Anyone that tells you otherwise is just being dishonest. But a book that helps wade into that debate in a very helpful way, I think, is Duane Garrett's book, Rethinking Genesis, the sources and authorship of the first book of the Pentateuch. Now, Garrett was the editor of the Archaeological Study Bible that I showed at the beginning of this video, and he is a renowned Old Testament scholar. This book, he takes Genesis in particular and shows why documentary approaches to its authorship don't really make as much sense as other approaches, including one that he tentatively suggests as being more plausible. So it's broken up into 3 parts with appendices. Part 1, the higher criticism of Genesis. Chapter 1, the documentary hypothesis. Chapter 2, form criticism, tradition, history, and Genesis. Chapter 3, Mosaic authorship and historical reliability. Then Part 2, the structure and sources of Genesis. Chapter 4, the Toledot and narrative sources of Genesis. Toledot it's the phrase, these are the generations of. That word generations of, or account of, or I forget how it's translated in different English translations. It's this Hebrew word Toledot. And that's what Genesis is structured around, which you see in chapter 5, the structure of Genesis. Chapter 6, the ancestor epics, or we'd say the patriarchal period. Chapter 7, the negotiation tales. Chapter 8, the gospel of Abraham. Chapter 9, the migration epic of Joseph. Then part 3, the authorship and composition of Genesis. Chapter 10, Genesis 1 and the primeval history. Chapter 11, Tradence of the Sources and the Israelite priesthood. Chapter 12, Memories of a Wandering People. And then Appendix 1 is a critique of 3 recent hypotheses of Pentateuchal origins. And Appendix 2 is the question of inspiration. So Garrett argues that Moses did use sources to compile Genesis and that there was redaction after Moses even, just not what traditional documentary scholarship has suggested. You don't need to know Hebrew in order to read it. The presumed audience is students of the Hebrew Bible, students of the Old Testament, whether at the college or graduate or even postgraduate level. So it is an academic work, but it's readable and understandable by any interested reader of Scripture. Rethinking Genesis by Duane Garrett, my 6th choice. And then lastly, my 7th choice. 7th is always the hard one because that's the cutoff and you have to not choose other books. The reason I picked this one is because it specifically lets people who disagree among themselves and to challenge and push back against one another. And that is Zondervan's 3 views on the New Testament use of the Old Testament. The contributors are Walter Kaiser, Darrell Bock, and Peter Enns. They take 3 different approaches to how the New Testament authors used Old Testament quotations, allusions, citations, and what that means for Christians today, readers, people who live in the New Covenant. How do we approach the Old Covenant? And particularly, how did the New Covenant writers of Scripture, how did they approach the Old Testament? This, like all of the volumes in Zondervan's Counterpoint series, does a great job of letting proponents of different views speak for themselves and then respond to each other. Part 1 is by Walt Kaiser, Single Meaning, Unified Reference. Accurate and authoritative citations of the Old Testament by the New Testament. Kaiser argues that the New Testament authors accurately understood the context of the Old Testament and accurately quoted the Old Testament. They weren't making up new meanings. They weren't engaged in creative rabbinical exegesis of later periods. Kaiser says, nope, they knew what they were doing, they knew what they were saying, and that's our job as well. And so then there's a response by Darrell Bock, and then a response by Peter Enns. Then part 2, Darrell Bock's chapter, Single Meaning, Multiple Contexts and Reference. The New Testament's legitimate, accurate, and multifaceted use of the Old. Bock takes the approach that the New Testament uses the Old Testament, but the Old Testament authors, what they had in mind for a meaning or a referent, let's say in a prophecy section, for instance, wasn't exhausted by its original context, that there could be newer applications for it. So an example would be the day of the Lord. Passages involving the day of the Lord seem to use apocalyptic cosmic imagery, but they actually describe in context the fall of empires like Babylon or Assyria. And so Bock takes the position that unknown to the authors of the Old Testament, they were also describing or using language that would accurately describe later events beyond the ones that they had in mind at their time. So then there's a response by Kaiser and a response by Enns. And then the third chapter, Fuller Meaning, Single Goal, a Christotelic approach to the New Testament use of the Old in its first century interpretive environment. So Peter Enns, takes the approach of reading everything through the lens of Jesus, the Christotelic approach, everything culminates in Jesus. And there's a response then by Kaiser and by Bock. And then the final chapter is an analysis of the three different views by our friend Kenneth Birding. We've had Kenneth on the channel twice to talk about his work, and he is an excellent New Testament scholar. So he sort of summarizes the debate and looks at the different views and the challenges. So this is just like listening in to a discussion among a handful of scholars where they get to push back against one another. These are all readable. You don't have to know original languages. They're not super scholarly, though they do get into scholarship. So the more comfortable you are with scholarly writings, the more you'll be able to track their discussion, but you don't have to be. So my final pick, 3 views on the New Testament use of the Old Testament in Zondervan's Counterpoint series. So there you go. Here are my 7 books and 2 honorable mention resources that I think anyone interested in studying the Old Testament needs to have read. If you haven't seen the prior video in this series, the first 7 resources that I picked, check that out and check out the other playlists we have here on the channel. We've got a lot of the teaching that I've done over the years includes and incorporates material in these. So check out our Bible Backgrounds playlist, our studies through the books of the Pentateuch. We got a lot more here at Disciple Dojo than just book reviews, but I get it. Book reviews get the most clicks. They're the ones that are the most algorithm friendly here on YouTube. So that's what a lot of people first see about this channel. Anyway, if this was helpful to you, a way you can be helpful to us is by subscribing to this channel. And let me know in the comments below, what did I leave off of the 2 lists that we've done, the 14 total resources, a little bit more, including honorable mentions. What has not made the cut that you think should have, and why? Leave that in the comment section below. I'd love to hear it. But that'll do for now. Take care. We'll see you back here next time at Disciple Dojo. As always, in the meantime, keep training.